Welcome to what we don't talk about when we talk about war. I'm Catherine Parnell, and I'm moderating the panel. And I want to thank all of you for coming. I know that it was a horrendous commute. I didn't want to walk through snow, or that you were out late last night. I know it's early, and I have my coffee. I hope you guys have yours. Yes? All right, good. Who's here from Bennington? All right, Bennington, people, what do I always say? Please turn off your cell phones. Thank you. Thank you very much. So, seriously, the theme for this panel is the subject of war, the unspeakable, the atrocities, the underreported or ignored. When writers address the subject of war, they face tough choices about what material to include and how to give voice to the unspeakable. We're going to look at how the choice of genre impacts the topic of war and what literature can achieve that journalism cannot. Most of us suppose, and I want to put heavy emphasis on that word suppose, that we recognize politics, the politics of war, when we see it. After all, we're writers, trained to be those on whom nothing is lost. What if we don't know we're already lost? How did we get lost? Did we fail to reconcile the collision of the political with the personal? Journalists are supposed to be fair-minded and impartial if you don't look at Fox News. Creative writers, on the other hand, dispense with this muddy mission of impartiality, and we opt instead for a more personal form of truth-telling, based in part on a personal experience, research, and in some cases, reporting. If we consider fiction, nonfiction, and poetry as oppositional works wherein complex ways of thinking and feeling about the individual and the war-torn world in which we live, how's that exposed to through a specific lens, with a specific goal? Those are questions that we as writers look at and perhaps provide a channel of resistance to what we see in the daily news. But first we have to find our way to what is told, what must be told, in spite of omission, negligence, propaganda, misinformation, and cover-ups. We have to talk about war. We live in a culture of fear, spin, and polemic, most of which is hidden behind the veil of national security. Think about the not-so-secret rendition program. We live in a world of technical and social acceleration, not to mention the effect of acceleration of this sort and what it does to the pace and quality of our life. Beam me up, Scotty, social media. We also live in a world of secrets, big secrets. People like Bradley Manning expose those secrets. Yet you can walk up and down Boylston Street and ask 20 wanderers who Bradley Manning is, and the majority won't be able to tell you. Why? Because the news about him tends to be ignored. It makes you wonder, in spite of all the time we spend online and how quickly we process information, what have we missed? And what don't we know about? And why don't we know about it? And if we do know about it, why aren't we writing about it? And if we are writing about it, as many of us are, why isn't it making a splash? The splash the Oscars for Downton Abbey makes. Then again, it might be as simple as this, a line from Bob Shikoch's forthcoming novel, The Woman Who Lost Her Soul. We choose the lies in which we participate, and in choosing, define ourselves and our actions for a very long time, perhaps forever. What are we participating in? That's what we're here to talk about. Let me introduce our panelists. They're going to talk for about 10 minutes, and then we're going to have a Q&A session, and I hope you guys have lots of questions. We're ready for you. To my right is George Kovac, a poet and veteran of the Vietnam War. He founded Consequence magazine. George, could you hold it up? Beautiful blue magazine, a journal about artistic and intellectual responses to war and its consequences. The magazine's mission is to publish exceptional work that offers a perspective on war that popular media cannot provide, and access to the range of human emotions only literature and art make possible. To my left, geez, I hope I'm on my right, to my left at this point. To my left is Siobhan Fallon, who is the author of You Know When the Men Are Gone. Her stories and essays have appeared in Publishers Weekly, Women's Day, Good Housekeeping, New Letters, Salamander, among others. And her latest work appears in the anthology Fire and Forget, Short Stories from the Long War, edited by Royce Granton. On the end here, Bob Chikochis. He's the author of 6 books of fiction and nonfiction, including The Immaculate Invasion, a chronicle of the American military intervention in Haiti in the 90s. His new novel, The Woman Who Lost Her Soul, fabulous novel, you guys are going to want to get it, will be published by Grove Atlantic in fall of 2013. He teaches in the writing programs at Bennington and Florida State. And in the middle here we have Laura Harrington. Her award-winning plays, musicals, and operas have been widely produced in the US and abroad. She teaches playwriting at MIT. Her first novel, Alice Bliss, won the Mass Book Award in Fiction. Alice Bliss has also been published in the UK, where it's a Richard and Judy Book Club selection, and in Italy and Denmark. So, take it away, George. Thank you.
Thank you, Kat. Can I be heard in the back? Is that good? Well, good morning, and thank you all for coming on an auspicious morning. It is an honor to be part of this distinguished panel addressing an important subject for writers, one that I think doesn't get enough attention in our literary community. I say not enough, even though war is a painfully familiar blade that erupts generation after generation, and good writers do pay attention to this scourge. But 20th century military tactics and strategies have evolved since 9/11, calling for fresh approaches to the conversation about war in a digital age. We need to be asking different questions not only because warfare has changed, but because those in the position to let loose the dogs are themselves a dangerous breed. Since the end of the Cold War, our political leaders and the powers that influence them no longer consider hot war a last resort. They've embraced preemptive war as a tool to get what they want and then dominate the adversary. This is an abandonment of principle. I'm referring to our country's former avowal of statesmanship, working in partnership with allies to avoid conflict. Preemptive and preventive wars are also breaches of international law and the UN Charter. They point to our decline and fall as a nation and as a culture. A pretty important concern and maybe a good approach for taking the subject of war head on. To a discussion of principles, we need to include a challenge to the moral basis for using methods this country has rejected in the past, like torture, black sites, and extrajudicial killings. The unmanned drone is an emblem of warfare today, a clean, efficient weapon that gets rid of the messy business of human beings facing off to kill one another. And it's highly unlikely that the next generation of drones will discriminate between civilians and fighters. It's not that these subjects aren't discussed in the media, they are. But our society since September 11 has been a tectonic shift in its attitude toward war, an attitude that enables, if not supports, abhorrent illegal acts in the name of national security. Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo come to mind. The standard definition of war is one society imposing its will on another by militant force. It's true, but it fails the test for full disclosure. It's hiding something. If you look at the word order, you'll see that between those muscular words, imposing and force, sits that ambiguous word, will. By the rules of grammar and logic, not to mention reason, that word should carry more weight. But will is a slippery concept, easily lost when we discuss war in terms of armies, weapons, heroism, and destruction. the willfulness of the aggressor and the intentions of his will are among the missing. Two of the many subjects we don't talk about when we talk about war. The profit-driven and increasingly ideological media in our country allow, and in some cases dictate, a superficial level of discourse that insults and infantilizes us. War is a given, they say. War is hell. Get used to it and believe what we tell you. More troubling, though, is how little we're told and how difficult it is to get the information we need. The Pentagon created embedded journalism to get the media to censor itself. Congressional oversight committees meet behind closed doors and classify information in the name of national security. We would not know that Apache gunships killed Iraqi civilians and 2 Reuters journalists when the Defense Department what they called collateral damage. Had WikiLeaks not posted a video and Bradley Manning not taken that gutsy step to upload it, nor would we have known about the covert U.S. missile strikes in Yemen or eavesdropping on UN Security General Kofi Annan before the Iraq invasion. In our society, there's a test of wills going on, one that needs to be discussed. The spin merchants in the West Wing of the White House control the war narrative. The media struggle to get at concealed facts and to preserve their integrity. And the rest of us try to decode the authorized version of the daily news. The so-called collective will of society is merely a trope. The will of powerful interests trumps the popular vote. And while oligarchs face the scrutiny of only those elites who keep them in power, thoughtful individuals, especially writers of conscience, who probe the thin atmosphere of mainstream dialogue, find few opportunities for inclusion in the national debate, such as it is. And who pays attention to mainstream debate? What is the role of genre in all this? Is it even possible to reach the general population, to get past the veneer of daily life, unmarred by war and issues of information and conscience? Ask yourself, what is going on? While we earn wages, send kids to school, volunteer at shelters, make grocery lists, and perform all the activities that define a society, an insidious culture of war thrives, sustained by portions of our earnings called taxes. The demands of a complex age easily distract us from matters beyond our control, exasperating problems we'd rather not face. And besides, they don't really involve us. Or do they? The default position is rely on self-assured pundits and broadcast information to make critical decisions, like supporting war. Iraq, for example, is an example. The spectacle of willfulness on the part of the Cheney-Bush coterie was an impressive display of fabricating narrative and bamboozling a nation in shock from 9/11. The triumph of their will quickly reached its shallow apogee under a historic banner on the deck of a warship. Leni Riefenstahl could not have staged it better. It's been pretty much downhill since then, a long and costly march to moral and financial disaster. The official war narrative, scripted in committee rooms and approved behind closed doors in Washington, still gets most of the media's attention. It has taken years of perseverance to dismantle the lies. The counter-narrative has been virtually clandestine because dissenting voices are shouted down on talk show radio, or strangled with yellow ribbons. As poets, writers, and artists, we might show the courage of people like Cindy Sheehan, who was arrested for protesting after her son was killed in Iraq. We might write about the leadership of women in grassroots organizations like Code Pink that oppose militarism. We could create fiction that reveals the complexities of a culture of war, and poems that let us feel true consequences of armed conflict around the world. Like Bradley Manning, we can be strong-willed contributors to the dialogue about war and stir a nation's conscience. The writers who appear in Consequence magazine show moral courage and strength of will. I'd like to say a few words about their work because their narratives invigorate the discourse that will be necessary as long as war is conceivable. They bring to the discussion provocative ideas and fresh perspectives that offer emotional as well as intellectual access to the extremes of human conduct. Access that literature is uniquely able to provide because it enables us to enter other lives, to see how it feels to witness torture, to experience torture, even to do the flogging. A sensitive writer can show us the stress of a drone pilot painting the mud house with a laser, then gently pulling the trigger on her joystick. We don't have to look any farther than the recent massacre at Sandy Hook Elementary School for evidence of such extremes. 20 children and 6 adults killed by one deranged man with access to unimaginable firepower. That's the latest tragedy in a parade of incomprehensible violence made possible in part because weapons designed for war are on sale at Walmart. How do we make sense of this? Gun culture is the focus of 2 well-crafted works in the current issue of Consequence. Lee Hancock's taut, compelling essay, Interview with a Gun, explains how Nidal Hassan bought a high-tech weapon and efficiently killed 13 and wounded 29 at Fort Hood, Texas, and how that exceptionally lethal handgun he chose made it so easy that any of us could do that. In David Abrams' powerful and poignant story, Guns, a young boy goes hunting with his father and is taught how to shoot elk. Later, as a soldier, the young man struggles toward competency with an M16 and with his own humanity. Both Hancock and Abrams speak to us about what it means to hold a fire and fire a gun. Try it sometime. You won't be the same. I'd like to mention in closing some other works in Consequence to illustrate our approach to the culture of war. There's a profoundly personal essay in this issue, Truth, Memory, Fiction, and My Brother's Death, that shows how documentation and the memory of witnesses affect a writer's ability to find the truth of her brother's death under the command of William Calley at My Lai. It illustrates the writer's challenge to deal with the passing of time and the different accounts of individuals as they rely on their own faulty recollections of words and actions during the extreme circumstances of war. In the previous issue, there's a soldier's journal composed of vivid emails from Afghanistan that has unusual immediacy and introspection. The entire entries comprise an intimate look into the danger, the boredom, the storm of emotions a combat soldier is forced to deal with. Consequence publishes a wide spectrum of amazing poems that range from reflections on personal freedom and resistance to tyranny, to poems that wrestle with the obscenity of war and social injustice, to poems that bear witness to the consequences of war. The culture of war we talk about also skews how people outside the comfort zone of the familiar and the personal perceive the world. Seeing how other cultures seeing how other cultures view and experience the complexities of war is essential to the mission of Consequence. We go out of our way to find faithful English translations of work by important writers from countries around the world that have known war. In the new issue released here at AWP, there's an excerpted chapter from a new novel about drug wars in Mexico by Homero Enriquez. We also have poetry in translation, 9 poems by Nguyen Ba Chung about an exile's return to Vietnam, and 2 by Chinese poet Sun Wenbo, enigmatic poems about the countenance of war and the desire for peace. Consequence seeks an international perspective because we have a critical need to understand other cultures, and if we do, we stand a better chance of seeing ourselves in a different light. Thank you.
George and Kat, for having this paper here today and for bringing us such an incredible magazine, Consequence. My name is Siobhan Fallon. When I write about America, or I tend to concentrate more on the home front than the action overseas. I try to examine not only how a combat deployment impacts individuals in the line of fire, but also the profound repercussions on that family waiting at home. The tangential fallout of our country's 10 years at war is what intrigues me, and that's the side of the war story paradigm that I find underreported in both journalism and as well as fiction literature. For the most part, I draw on my own experience as an Army spouse. In writing the stories in my collection, You Know When the Men Are Gone, my husband was the company commander of a 160-man infantry unit at Fort Hood, Texas. And thanks to the tradition of the United States Army, by default I became the Family Readiness Group leader, which means I was the main point of contact for all of those families, spouses, moms, dads, anyone who wanted to find out information about their soldier. So when they would hear about a casualty or a suicide bomber on the news, all those family members would call me. For example, there's a 16-year-old wife in our group. There's a 21-year-old wife who is also the mother of 3. We had spouses who suspected their soldiers of cheating, and spouses who admitted to cheating on their soldiers to me. We had a spouse who had cancer and a spouse who lost a child. I spoke to a mom on the phone a few minutes after she learned her soldier son was in critical condition at the Baghdad ER, and when no one knew if he was going to make it or not. So witnessing these sorts of experiences, which were challenging in their own right, especially to the families who were going through them instead of just me who was listening. But this was also coinciding with our surge of troops into Iraq. You probably remember that. Especially bases that were really heavy with infantry and armor battalions, like Fort Hood, Texas. And during the surge, everyone was caught up in a very revved up deployment cycle, which is very different than any other deployment cycle in our country's history. So soldiers were deploying for anywhere from 9 to 15 months. And if they were lucky, they'd return home for a year, and then they'd deploy again. And during that year, there's a lot of training and the awareness and anxiety that they were getting ready to go once again. So even though I had been an Army wife for a few years at this point, as an FRG leader, I sort of had a very new insight into sort of a wide spectrum of Army families in that specific point in time. And it made me realize how little I knew about that world. And if I was clueless, I realized how little other people outside of the Army community understood, what was happening inside these gates at a military base. And that's the sort of thing that inspired me to start writing and focusing my writing on, Army families, and try and create a window into that world of our volunteer military force, who represent less than 1% of America, and who deploy over and over again, and because of that are bearing both the physical and the psychological burdens of our country at war. So I was wanting or hoping to examine what it was like for our soldiers to be in a place where they don't understand the culture, the religion, the language, the enemy is not wearing a uniform, and even the victory isn't something tangible. They're got these ideas of democracy, and it's sort of a hard thing for 19-year-olds to get behind in the same way that we had something like for World War I and World War II. And then you have the spouse characters, of course, who are at home, and they're neither the long-suffering Penelope nor the adulterous Floozy who's out spending her husband's deployment pay the moment he leaves. But you have the very human gradation in between, and the spouses are struggling with their own battles, dealing with the adjustment of their soldier's absence, and then dealing with the transition when that soldier returns. I also tried to examine what the children were going through in the military world. Growing up with a parent who's 7,000 miles away for a really long time, especially in a kid's life, and the parent is missing all of those milestones that those children are hitting. And for me, my husband was gone when my daughter was 6 months, and he came back when she was 1.5 years, so he missed her first words, her crawling and walking, and just all of those moments. And thank God she was little at that point, and she's doing a lot more exciting things now, and unfortunately he's home. First of all, I was writing, the instinct for me as an Army spouse and as a member of this community was to try to create very upstanding pillars, and my characters were great Americans. But I realized I'm a writer, and I had to portray the good and the bad in my stories. And I think there are certain moments of heroism and goodness, but it's the murkier exchanges, the shades of gray that human beings wrestle with, and moral ambiguities, and the relationship strained by distance, and sometimes difficult reintegrations. And those themes were what I wanted to illuminate and sort of really concentrate on. So, thus writing fiction. I thought fiction gave me a greater objectivity and a distance that I couldn't manage if I had tried to write nonfiction or a memoir. It allowed me to sort of absorb the reality around me and transform it and get inside my characters, especially those who sort of fell through the Army support system cracks. And more importantly, for me at least, it allowed me to understand my characters without judging them in a way I might have done if I was writing about real, flawed human beings. I feel that it sort of works the same for me as a reader. When I read fiction, I'm connecting with a character in a way that I usually don't with nonfiction. Fiction demands the active participation of the reader, and the author and the reader collude in a way to sort of flesh that character out. The author provides a certain amount of detail, but the reader is responsible for filling in the blanks and visualizing that figment of their imagination. Therefore, the reader becomes engaged in the creation of that character. And I think this cements a more emotional attachment and creates a stronger sense of empathy for those characters. And sort of fiction then was allowing me to invite readers into the head of my soldiers and spouses to feel the particular isolation, anxiety, and uncertainty about their future, so that the next time that the reader sees a picture of a soldier in the media, or maybe a family member waving a flag at a welcome home ceremony, I was hoping the reader would see an entire person rather than that stock or iconic image. I also really felt that the form of short stories, or that method of telling, more closely echoed the upheaval I was seeing at the Army. And at that time, each story sort of shifts focus entirely from one family or soldier to another. And in this episodic and disjointed way, I felt like I was emphasizing how the Army community, whether it's friends in the same housing building or guys sitting next to each other in a chow hall, or total strangers from one side of the base to the other, are affected. Lives cross paths occasionally, but Fort Hood is a really big place. And sometimes there's a shared apartment or a Humvee. But like life, I didn't want too much overlap. Even the physical nature of the short story page breaks, those multiple beginnings and ends, it seemed to give an element of upheaval that I wanted to use to my advantage in writing. I hoped to recreate that sense of distance and separateness and the difficulty of forming connections and the suddenly split seconds that can change a life forever. So that's why I chose fiction, and particularly short stories. And it seemed to me to be the best way to articulate what I saw in America at the time of war, and sort of conjuring up as truthfully as possible and mimicking in my writing style the effects of that war on the people who fought it, as well as those that they finally come home to.
I just want to echo off what Siobhan just told you. This is an email that I got last month from a friend of mine who's a lieutenant colonel in the Special Forces and has been in and out of Afghanistan for a long time. Here's the email. One of the women who walked the patrol with us was a single mom of a preteen girl. I remember she fretted over her daughter's wardrobe. Scantily clad came to mind in between daily patrols. She had a phone that allowed her to text her daughter, who was in Texas, living with grandparents. She was on the patrol after I left, where the FS guy SF guy, Special Forces guy, lost both legs and bled out. Her weight saved her. The pressure plate bomb she stepped on was rigged for someone over 250 pounds. 10 people, including her, stepped in the exact same spot, a tactic of making the lead guy the mine clearer without incident. When the SF guy, who looked like he could bench press a small car and weighed close to 300 pounds with all his kit, stepped in her footprint, the blast flattened everybody, ultimately killing him. I can only imagine the woman I'm thinking of explaining to her daughter why she can't wear the spaghetti strap top to school after mom had to wash the guy off her who was almost atomized from the waist down earlier in the day. So I'd like to ask you rhetorically, what makes you an American writer, besides the fact that you live in America? When you think about yourself as an American writer, what is it that you think? What are your own influences? What's your temperament? Are you angry or detached? Where does subversiveness fit into your mandate? Or for that matter, where does nationalism? Do you have an answer? Must you have an answer? Or would you like to think about it for a few more years, which is fine with me, but don't take forever. And I'd like to ask you this. Is our radical focus on individuality, when processed through our culture, actually paradoxically self-negate, creating a tattooed army of think-alikes and do-alikes, untethered from the moral duty of a free writer, in the words of Edward Abbey, to be a critic of his own community, her own country, his own culture? Who actually has a self these days when the individual is so commodified? How to cling to this most precious yet evasive possession? I wonder how much history is the answer, the remedy, the antidote to the tyranny of the collective moment. We experience culture as a herd, albeit a polarized herd. Or perhaps we have no choice but to experience history and its furies and glories as individuals. Philip Lopate talks about the Irish essayist Hubert Butler, who had always believed that local history is more important than national history, and that sort of makes sense, but when the history is New York and it's 9/11, it seems awfully local to the entire nation, right? So maybe so, but and yet there are times they are one and the same, the local history and the national history. And the whole dynamic I'm gesturing at here is, for me at least, a partial, if inadequate, explanation about the current popularity of nonfiction, especially nonfiction about America as a warrior nation. I'm sure everybody would agree that we are a warrior nation, one of the most aggressive in history. So perhaps you'll remember back in August 2011, Michiko Kakutuni's commentary in the Times on 9/11's influence on the arts, which spawned all this ostensible self-questioning within the literary village. Her conclusion about post-9/11 literature was that the nonfiction writers hit home runs while novelists were sort of duds, incapable of, quote, getting beyond the obvious, unquote. And that's quite a challenge to novelists. How indeed do we get beyond the obvious? The more so in a culture where novelists as diverse as the former, God rest his soul, Barry Hannah, but Philip Roth and others have asserted that reality now outperforms anything that writers can imagine, and so they don't read novels anymore. Where does that leave the ambitious writer? Still, it's true that nonfiction defies fiction to be relevant. The most powerful imagining of who we are these days is accomplished by the media and politicians and Hollywood and marketeers, and less so by writers and artists. So here's another email I got from this same guy I just read to you. He was working down at SOCOM at MacDill Air Force Base in Tampa. The SOCOM is Special Operations Command, and they're basically running the world these days. But anyway, he sent me an email in response to an article he had read in New York Magazine about the French celebrity philosopher and writer Bernard-Henri Lévy. Special Forces guys read these guys, who had successfully urged, this guy, Levy, had successfully urged Sarkozy and Hillary Clinton to intervene in Libya. And the colonel wrote me to say, I think there's hope for the developed world if it will again listen to philosophers and artists instead of technocrats and accountants. Special Forces guy, right? You're by default being shaped by the dreams of people who don't know how to dream, except as their dreams are inspired by profit and power. That's not the condition of an enlightened society or a sophisticated society or even a healthy society. We assign very little merit to literary works and certainly no urgency. And yet there is a world out there overrun with pundits and bloggers, and writers, literary writers, novelists and poets in particular, are needed who have a sense of the reality and scope of that world. And the question I ask myself and ask you is, what does the novelist have to give us that the pundit can't? And I have no ready answer at hand except the conventional answers you might expect, which all boil down to the relentless intimacy of literature. Pundit can't give you that. But I wonder about the value of these chestnuts here in 2012, when the noosphere expanding daily in an order of magnitude previously inconceivable, and all of us nibbling away at its bloated carcass. Is this faltering of literature, if it actually exists, simply our destiny as a nation and as writers? Has the prophecy of our insignificance been there all along, nailed to the rough-hewn door of our creation during a much quieter world, round and not yet flattened, rich with time, enough in space for literature to awaken and probe the human moral imagination? Certainly 9/11 was a turning point, making us come to terms with the fact that in our lifetime the nation has moved into adulthood, where its experiment is no longer new, and its newness no longer an acceptable rationalization for its mistakes and shortcomings. For the past 10 years I've been working on a novel, a political novel to be sure, and now it's done. A novel set, perhaps foolishly, on 3 different continents with 4 separate but interlocking chronologies, each backdropped by a different war, which I think more than 10, but I'm not sure, maybe less than 50 characters. I've not forgotten, I've never counted the characters in this fucking novel. You know, if that isn't clear evidence that I'm an idiot, then try this. The novel clocks out at 839 pages. I've become, not with any enthusiasm, but of my own free will, a recluse hunkered down in the wilderness, betrothed to this monster. For a garret-bound writer, life is just this. It's merely work and hard and not romantic and not noble. The struggle has little to do with cosmic truth or mankind's troubled soul, and much to do with energy and concentration and the monotony of the dreamlike repetition of one's lonely days. But to be perfectly honest, I confess to a knot in my stomach about this book's impending publication this September. Not for all the apparent reasons, that it's a doorstop, that it cannot survive the fruit fly attention span of the contemporary personality, that the publishing business seems to have self-inflicted itself with a mortal wound. That books are on the way out anyway. Really, I don't care. These are not my concerns. Instead, I'm haunted by Kakatuni's depressingly correct assessment of the shelf of post-9/11 novels, till recently, last year really, that is, that they seem to be unable to get beyond the obvious. Uh-oh. Have I spent the past 10 years afflicted by the same incapacity? More to the point, is there some organic, innate barrier that will block a writer, an American writer, from effectively dramatizing our shared experience as a nation? Not too many of us really do that. But what could that possibly be, that barrier? And even if such a thing does exist, shouldn't we be knocking our heads against it anyway? Understanding the aesthetic and intellectual topography of the challenge begins with the assumption that the novel is a very accommodating venue for narrating history, the panorama of events, while the narration of the day's headlines, saturating our senses and brains, is better left to nonfiction, which if you're a dilettante or a news junkie like me, you can further mine all that stuff for information, and with the book-length reportage that's out there, which has been damn good. The political fiction does a little better with invoking the mystique and allure of history, and a reader's desire to relive what was never lived, or lived only glancingly. Don DeLillo, when confronted by the obvious, collapsed into pretension and affectation in his rather awful, I hate to say this about DeLillo, he's one of my favorite writers, but his rather awful 9/11 book, Falling Man. And perhaps Chekhov would have had more luck with the material, but I doubt it, given the truth that the mirror art of this was never going to be as powerful in its reflections as the very real, identical feelings and thoughts and responses, the fear and the horror and the ashes and the pain and the sadness you yourself were carrying around from what you experienced essentially only yesterday. On the other hand, the scale of events, the expanse of causes and effects, and the zeitgeist of an era itself requires a Tolstoy. And at this level, DeLillo succeeds spectacularly in books like Underworld, which is a masterpiece of the Cold War, and the Cold War ethos, and Libra, a mesmerizing novel that explores the state within the state of American power, which is something I attempt within my own novel. The first rule of avoiding the obvious is don't look at it. Underworld begins with a baseball game. My book begins with a murder mystery in Haiti, then jumps to the end of World War II in Croatia, then the life of a 17-year-old American girl in Istanbul in 1986, etc., and the plotting slams to a full stop in 1999, although the novel is very much a 9/11 novel, a prelude to our current state of perpetual war. Nonfiction writers could tackle such events in the moment. Novelist Norman Mailer suggested after 9/11 would be wise to slow up and wait 10 years or more to allow the events to ripen and begin to collect the patina and gravitational perspectives of history. My first book about war was nonfiction and was certainly driven by my eyewitness account of the action on the ground. This novel I've just finished is very much a story about war, but there's really no war in it. There's us. Just a gesturing toward the horizon where the clouds are gathering and darkening, and us. That gesturing seems to explain so much more about what's happened to us since 9/11 in our culture and in our psyches than I believe a more conventional war story might reveal. Don't look at it. Look at the baseball game, a football game, a murder in Haiti, an 8-year-old boy in Croatia. Just try to find what resonates and endures. As for being an American writer, I want to finally accept whatever indictment comes with that identity, which is not the identity of race or sex or religion, but of place and its ensuing complicities. As one of the protagonists in my novel quips, how can it be a conspiracy if everybody's in on it? And yes, we're in on it. We're at the very core of it. There's not a person in this room whom the world doesn't reduce to one basic fact: your Americanness, when they encounter you on their own turf. And there are myriad places out there over the horizon where if I put you on the ground in the morning, you're going to be dead or kidnapped by the time the sun goes down, because whatever you are doesn't matter except that you're an American. You know this, and yet sometimes maybe you don't know this. But as I said, if I'm to be indicted, indict me as an American, and not for something so unimportant as being white or being male or whatever. I'm not rubbing myself in the ashes of blame or adorning myself with the medals of triumphalism. I'm not acquiescing to anyone's hatred for me as an American, but I accept it, without rancor, but also without self-blinding or paranoia. This is neither resignation nor patriotism, nor any passive acceptance of guilt or proclamation of innocence, as it is a declaration of accountability. That thing for which it seems no one in the system wants to stand up for and be counted. It's a moving into accountability as Adrienne Rich writes in her own attempt to understand who she is and what that means and what it calls for. It's a moving into accountability, enlarging the range of accountability. When that formidable monkey king George Bush told the jihadists, "Bring it on," I indulged in a fancy, telling myself he wasn't challenging America's enemies. He was speaking to us, America's sons and daughters in the literary village. Bring it on, you damn poets. Bring it on, scribblers, one and all. Give me your best shot. Show me what you've got. I dare you. I'll blow your ass to smithereens with my iPad. I will Netflix you and your mom into oblivion and deep fry your brain with tweets. I will crush you with an audience addled by moral sloth and a heedless nation dithering with moral bankruptcy. Oh yeah? I'd like to think writers would say in one voice, is that so? Then you have to pry our dead cold fingers from the keyboard, Jack. Our lives, this is a quote, our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. Martin Luther King said that, and you know that's true. Thanks.
Good morning, and I too am very honored to be here talking with you and with this distinguished panel. Bob, you're a tough act to follow. You're a tough act to follow.
No.
What do we know about the wars we are waging? The vast majority of us can choose not to pay attention, as if this choice is similar to choosing what toothpaste to buy or what television program to watch. And what role does our distraction play in these conflicts? If we aren't watching, can we be held responsible? When a war can last longer than a decade and requires neither our attention nor our participation, what does this do to our national identity? Following on what Bob was talking about, what do the words civic responsibility and service and sacrifice mean to those of us living in America now? My personal life and my writing life have been deeply impacted by what we don't talk about when we talk about war. My father taught me a profound respect for silence. A navigator bombardier in World War II, he came home and had what was then called a nervous breakdown and never talked about his experiences. I have been deeply influenced by my father's silence, both its limitations and its extraordinary strength. He showed his devotion not by spilling his secrets, but by shielding me from them. In addition, he sparked a lifelong curiosity and empathy. He gave me the most profound gift you can give a writer. He taught me to pay attention to all that is not said, to be alive to the mysterious silences that surround us, and he inspired me to give voice to that silence. As a playwright, I've written about war for much of my career, from the warrior Saint Joan of Arc to Napoleon in exile at St. Helena, from the destruction of the library in Louvain, Belgium in the very first days of World War I, to 4 very young survivors encountering each other in the last days of the Civil War. Did I reach anyone? Enlighten anyone? Does anyone in America want to go to a play about war, no matter how well you craft the story? Maybe not. Imagine this scene, husband and wife at breakfast table. She says, "Honey, let's go see that play about waterboarding." Actually, she won't get to suggest seeing that play because no one will produce that play. What's a playwright to do if the medium you are working in is hostile to the difficult subject that obsesses you? Do you retire? Retool? On commission, I wrote a 30-minute, one-act, one-woman musical called Alice Unwrapped, about a 14-year-old girl whose father is missing in Iraq. She copes with this crushing uncertainty by using duct tape and Kevlar to create a homemade version of the armor she imagines her father is wearing, plus combat boots, plus a bike helmet. And she goes to high school in this outfit, all while trying to take care of her little sister and her mother, who won't leave the bedroom. The revelation for me as a writer was how relatable this kid was, Audiences laughed and cried with Alice and recognized her deep sense of honor as she tried to take care of her family in her father's absence. I seemed to have found a new key to writing about war. Put a kid center stage, have her cope with missing her dad, and all the other challenges of growing up, all while the war is the unseen protagonist. My inspiration, or perhaps compulsion, in writing the novel Alice Bliss was to tell the stories we never hear, the stories we sweep under the rug, the ones we label collateral damage. My challenge became, how do we lift that which we prefer to ignore into the spotlight and make it absolutely unforgettable? This is the task of the artist in whatever medium we choose. I learned that there's an invisible army in our midst, as Siobhan spoke so eloquently about, an army of mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, wives, and children of soldiers who are deployed. According to the Department of Defense, only 37% of military families live on military installations. The remaining 63% live in over 4,000 communities nationwide. Your community and mine. They live around the corner, down the street, in the house next door, in the apartment above or below us. And there are more than 1.7 million military children and teens scattered across the country. They feel proud and angry and confused and frightened and worried and every other emotion that is part of growing up. But each emotion is amplified by the war and every fear it raises, and how achingly specific and personal that fear is to each one of those children. Most of us have the luxury of thinking the war is distant. These children do not. They live with this war day in and out. They wake up with it. They fall asleep with it. It is woven into the fabric of their daily lives. They are expected to carry on at home and at school, to pretend that they do not have a parent who is risking his or her life, to pretend that they are not consumed with worry, that their daily life is not affected by this absence. These children, our children, are staring down a long year of a parent's deployment or redeployment, living with the fact of a father or mother in harm's way, a euphemism we all accept even though it mocks the harsh reality of every soldier's experience. To those fighting and those at home, waiting and praying, what occurs during deployment goes so far beyond the word harm as to be ludicrous. And we are not even talking about the long-lasting harm of post-traumatic stress or the shockingly high incidence of loss of limbs. This is part of our fuzzy language, fuzzy thinking, fuzzy policy, which creates a vague sense of unease amongst the general populace, but does nothing to goad us into action. How can we share the burdens of this war more equitably? Should we take a page from World War II and adopt compulsory military service, higher taxes, gas and oil rationing, war bonds, victory gardens, scrap and metal collection? Perhaps because we live with the illusion that our current conflicts cost us so little, we shrug our shoulders, turn a blind eye, and allow it to go on and on. These burdens should be shared by everyone in our country, and I would like to argue by men and women writers alike. Do we give equal time and, more importantly, equal weight to men and women writing about war? And if not, why not? How does the storyteller impact not only the conversation, but our attitudes and beliefs about war? Here's what I've noticed recently about books about war. Men, since they've been on the front lines longer than women, the battle scenes, while the battles at home are relegated to the back burner. We need to acknowledge that the risks of war are shared by everyone involved, both those deployed and those at home. When a father or mother is killed, a family is fractured forever. And how best to experience and understand the nature of that fracture than through the family's eyes. Yet we see this part of the story, the collateral damage as experienced by wives, children, parents, etc., as secondary to the main event. What would happen if we reversed the way we look at this? Let me get specific. There are several wonderful books that have been written in the past year about the Iraq War, which are getting a lot of play. I'm thinking of Ben Fountain's Billy Lynn's Long Halftime Walk, Keith Powers' The Yellow Birds, David Abrams' Fobbit. Last year, it was Sebastian Junger's War and Karl Marlantes, What It Means to Go to War. In newspapers and online, these books are often written about together. The authors are sometimes interviewed together. This is wonderful. I am a fan of these books. But it is fascinating to me that the books written by women about the Iraq War are rarely mentioned at all, and as far as I have seen, never mentioned with the men's books. This is not just my book, but also Siobhan Fallon's novel, collection of short stories, Kristen Hanna's Homefront, Johanna Trollope's The Soldier's Wife, to name a few. This is disturbing to me for several reasons. Leaving the probable sexism aside, all of these books deal with the costs of war in one way or another, but the women's books deal with the costs that we rarely see and almost never talk about, the costs borne by women and children. Celebrating the male experience of war, intentionally or not, celebrates war, and is in the great literary tradition of glorifying the power of personal sacrifice in the theater of war. I believe that this is a larger story than just which books get attention. It's a story about how we think about war, how we imagine it and talk about it, and how we perpetuate myths of heroes and anti-heroes alike. When Life magazine published photographs of the fallen soldiers following Hamburger Hill in Vietnam, it was instrumental in turning the tide against the war. When the New York Times this past fall published the photographs of the U.S. dead, there was no public outcry whatsoever. Until we can hear the stories of all who were impacted by war, soldiers and civilians, the families who are left behind, the families who are inadvertently caught up in the struggle, we are lying to ourselves. We prefer the shine of brass, the extraordinary design of drones, the comforting flaunting of military might. Writers can lift the curtain, expose the flim-flam, push us to engage. What will awaken us to the legion of hurt among our own servicemen and women, their children and families? What will awaken us to the unspeakable destruction of land and life wherever we are dropping bombs? Does the entire nation have a hurt locker where we hide this war and its costs? What would happen if we opened it up and looked inside? What would happen if the book in your hands brought these questions into the light and these characters into your heart? Thank you.
Very much, Bob, Laura, Sean, and George. That was wonderful. We have about 15 minutes to take some of your questions. Does anybody? Yes, back here.
Hi, my name is Roy Trent, and I'm one of the editors of Fire Forget, which is a collection of short stories. Hi, by veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan. And I'm a veteran myself of Iraq. And when I came back, I found some people expected me to be a hero, some people expected me to be a victim, some people expected me to be a, deranged killer, you don't know what he's going to do. But nobody wanted to let me be a person who had an experience. People on the left didn't want to hear about how proud I was of my service and my fellow soldiers. People on the right didn't want to hear about how stupid and destructive the occupation of Iraq looked like. And so it seems to me one of the things that we don't talk about when we talk about war is how there's not one truth to war, or even two truths. There's 1,000 truths. There's millions of truths about any given war, especially about say the last 10 years of war. So my question to you all is how can we as writers and poets and teachers move beyond the reductive political binary, pro-war, anti-war, and into, as George said, a more complex consideration of the many truths of war.
I talked about not looking at the obvious. And that's a two-way thing too. The writer can't look at the obvious, but also people looking at you and your experience can't look at the obvious either if they care. As you well know, people come home from war and they don't talk because when they start talking to anybody, they can see the drift in the attention. And that person, you know, that female soldier or male soldier absolutely knows the conversation has ended, and it's sort of ended forever. Because nobody's going to understand except the people you were there with. It's impossible to understand. And the closest you could ever rebuild it is through a novel, through a story, maybe through a film. But I don't, you know, you're just talking about experience in human nature, and the returning vet has traditionally not been able to come home, ever, because nobody can understand what's going on. And of course, the more vets write, the more they can understand. On the other side of it, I don't think a foreign correspondent who's embedded overseas with a unit, I don't think their job is done until they come home with that unit and really see that full experience, the expansive experience that somebody in the military goes through who's deployed into a combat zone. Come home with those people, and wow, you can see how hard it is and how different they are than the person you knew out in the field. But I don't know how well that answers your question. I just know that silence is the default mode that everybody who has ever been in war chooses, because they just see, you know, the drift in people's eyes when you're trying to tell them something.